The text message appeared on my phone at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October, glowing like a neon sign in the darkness of my bedroom. It was from my youngest daughter, Chloe, sent from the group chat she shared with her 2 older brothers. Maybe we'd all be better off if Mom just wasn't around anymore. This whole situation would be so much easier to handle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at those words until they burned into my retinas, my hands trembling as I scrolled up to see the conversation that had led to this moment. My children, my 3 beautiful children whom I had raised as a single mother after their father abandoned us when Chloe was only 2 years old, were discussing my death like it was a business transaction. Like I was nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle standing between them and something they desperately wanted. The house felt suffocating suddenly. This 4-bedroom colonial in Westfield that I had worked 3 jobs to afford, where I had bandaged scraped knees and celebrated report cards and hosted countless sleepovers. Every room held memories of sacrifices I had made gladly, believing that love and dedication would create the kind of family bond that could weather any storm. As I lay there in the darkness, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of a house that had sheltered us for 15 years, I realized that the storm had been building for longer than I wanted to admit, and I had been standing in the eye of it, blind to the destruction swirling around me. My name is Maddie Roberts, and at 62 years old, I thought I had figured out most of life's essential lessons. I was wrong about almost everything that mattered. For 34 years, I had built my entire identity around being a mother, pouring every ounce of my energy, my resources, and my dreams into raising 3 children who I believed would someday understand the depth of my love and sacrifice. Instead, they had become strangers who saw me as nothing more than a means to an end, and that end, apparently, would be much easier to achieve if I simply ceased to exist. The conversation thread that led to Chloe's devastating message had started innocuously enough. My eldest son, Marcus, who was 31 and worked as a marketing manager in downtown Chicago, had been complaining about his student loan payments again. Despite graduating from Northwestern 8 years ago with a degree I had sacrificed my own retirement savings to help fund, Marcus seemed to believe that his financial struggles were somehow my responsibility to solve. His messages were always the same blend of entitlement and manipulation that had become his signature communication style over the past few years. Mom's being totally unreasonable about the house situation, Marcus had written to his siblings. She could easily take out a reverse mortgage or sell and downsize. She doesn't need all that space, and we could really use the equity to get our lives on track. But she's being stubborn about it, acting like we're asking for something crazy when we're just trying to plan for everyone's future. Tyler, my middle child at 29, had jumped into the conversation with his usual blend of pseudo-psychology and financial pressure. Tyler had dropped out of law school after 2 years. A decision that had cost me nearly $40,000 in loans that I was still paying off, and had since drifted through a series of failed business ventures and get-rich-quick schemes. His latest obsession was cryptocurrency trading, which seemed to involve him losing money at an alarming rate, while maintaining an unwavering confidence that his next investment would make him wealthy. Marcus is right, Tyler had responded. Mom's got this weird emotional attachment to material things that's honestly kind of unhealthy. She's sitting on like $300,000 in home equity while we're all struggling with debt that could be eliminated if she just made some practical decisions. It's actually kind of selfish when you think about it. She raised us to believe family comes first, but then she won't make the obvious choice to help her own children when they need it most. And then Chloe, my baby girl who had turned 27 last month, had delivered the final blow. Chloe worked as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, a job that I had been incredibly proud of, until I realized that her medical knowledge had given her insights into exactly how inconvenient my continued existence was for their collective financial planning. Her message had been the most calculated and coldly practical of all. Honestly, guys, think about it logically, she had written. Mom's retirement account has like $200,000 plus the house, plus her life insurance policy from the school district that she always said was to take care of us. If something happened to her naturally, we'd each inherit enough to completely change our lives. But instead, She's going to spend the next 20 years slowly draining all of that money on her own living expenses, and by the time she actually dies, there won't be anything left for us except debt. Maybe we'd all be better off if Mom just wasn't around anymore. This whole situation would be so much easier to handle. Reading those words felt like being hit by a truck in slow motion. Each syllable landed with the weight of a physical blow, and I found myself gasping for air as if someone had knocked the wind out of me. These were the children I had sacrificed everything for. The reason I had worked double shifts as a high school guidance counselor while also cleaning office buildings on weekends. They were the motivation behind every choice I had made for over 3 decades, from turning down a promotion that would have required relocating to refusing to date seriously because I didn't want to complicate their lives with a stepfather. I had given up my dreams of traveling, of pursuing the master's degree in psychology that I had always wanted, of having any kind of social life or romantic relationship. Every dollar I earned went toward their needs, their wants, their futures. When Marcus needed money for his fraternity dues, I sold my grandmother's engagement ring. When Tyler decided he wanted to study abroad in Spain, I took out a second mortgage on the house. When Chloe needed a reliable car for her nursing clinicals, I drove my 12-year-old Honda for 3 more years until the transmission finally gave out completely. And this was how they saw me. Not as a woman who had devoted her life to their well-being, but as an obstacle to their financial security. A problem to be solved, preferably through my convenient disappearance from their lives. I had always known that my children were somewhat entitled. Growing up without a father had made me overcompensate in ways that I recognized were probably unhealthy, but I told myself that providing them with stability and opportunities was worth the sacrifice. I wanted them to feel secure in ways that I never had as a child, growing up in a family where money was always scarce, and love felt conditional on good behavior and academic achievement. My own mother had been a bitter woman who never let me forget that my existence had cost her opportunities and happiness. She worked as a seamstress in a factory and came home every evening exhausted and resentful, ready to catalog all the ways that raising a child had limited her options and drained her resources. I had sworn that my children would never feel that burden, would never question whether they were wanted and valued. I thought I was breaking a cycle of emotional neglect and financial anxiety. Instead, I had created something entirely different but equally destructive. I had raised children who saw love as a transaction, who measured their worth by what they could extract from others, who had never learned to consider anyone's needs but their own. In trying to give them everything I had never had, I had failed to teach them the most important lessons about gratitude, empathy, and the value of hard work. The signs had been there for years, but I had made excuses and rationalized their behavior because acknowledging the truth felt too devastating to bear. When Marcus graduated from college and immediately moved back home while making no effort to find a job, I told myself he was just taking time to find the right opportunity. When Tyler dropped out of law school without warning, leaving me responsible for loans that would take me years to pay off, I convinced myself that he was just figuring out his path, and that the education had value even if he didn't finish the degree. When Chloe started demanding that I cover her car payments, her credit card bills, and her student loans even though she was working full-time as a registered nurse, I rationalized it as temporary help while she got established in her career. I had been so afraid of becoming like my own mother, so determined to be supportive and understanding, that I had never set boundaries or expectations that would have taught them to respect me or anyone else. The financial pressure had been building for months before that devastating text message conversation. Marcus had been dropping increasingly unsubtle hints about my wasted living space and the selfish decision to maintain a house that was larger than what one person needed. Tyler had started sending me articles about reverse mortgages and the benefits of downsizing for senior citizens, always accompanied by messages about how much the extra money could help all of us plan for the future. Chloe had taken a more direct approach, sitting me down during Sunday dinner the week before and presenting what she called a family financial plan that involved me liquidating essentially all of my assets to pay off their collective debts and fund their various life goals. She had spreadsheets and charts, a professional presentation that treated my life savings like a community resource that we could allocate for maximum family benefit. "Mom, you're 62 years old," she had said with the patronizing tone usually reserved for small children or patients with dementia. "You need to start thinking realistically about your remaining years and what legacy you want to leave. Do you want to spend your retirement money on yourself, living alone in this big house? Or do you want to invest in your children's futures and create something that benefits all of us? The word invest had stuck with me for days afterward, as if my decades of sacrifice hadn't been investment enough. As if the hundreds of thousands of dollars I had already spent on their education, their emergencies, their wants and needs and whims, hadn't demonstrated my commitment to their futures. They wanted more, and they had convinced themselves that they deserved it. That Tuesday night, lying in my bedroom reading their group chat conversation about how much easier their lives would be if I simply died, I finally understood that I had failed at the most basic level of parenting. I had raised children who were incapable of love in any form that didn't directly benefit them.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
They didn't see me as a person with my own needs, dreams, and right to exist. I was nothing more than a resource to be depleted, and they were growing impatient with how slowly that depletion was occurring. The house felt different that night, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the toxicity of what I had discovered. Every family photo lining the hallways seemed to mock me, with images of birthday parties and graduations and holidays where I had believed we were building something meaningful together. The kitchen where I had packed thousands of lunches and cooked countless family dinners felt like a museum of wasted effort. The living room where we had watched movies and played board games during their childhood seemed haunted by the ghost of a family that had never really existed. I had spent so many years being proud of the life I had built for us, the stability I had provided, the opportunities I had created for their success. I thought our close family unit was something special, something that would endure and strengthen over time as they matured and started families of their own. I imagined myself as the beloved grandmother who would be included in their lives, valued for my wisdom and cherished for my decades of devotion. Instead, I was apparently nothing more than an inconvenient delay to their inheritance plans. A woman whose continued breathing represented a financial loss that they were tired of tolerating. As I sat there in the darkness, scrolling through months of similar conversations that I had never seen before, I realized that this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a particularly bad day. This was how my children really saw me, how they had probably seen me for years. Every family dinner, every holiday celebration, every phone call where they had seemed interested in my life had been performance, a way of maintaining access to my resources while they waited for me to become more useful to them dead than alive. The betrayal felt like drowning in slow motion. Each breath became more difficult as the weight of their deception settled into my chest. These were the people I had trusted more than anyone else in the world, the individuals for whom I had gladly sacrificed my own happiness and future security. I had believed that motherhood was the most important role I would ever play, that raising good human beings was the greatest contribution I could make to the world. But I hadn't raised good human beings. I had raised monsters who wore familiar faces and knew exactly which words to say to manipulate my emotions and extract what they needed from me. They had learned to mimic love and gratitude while feeling nothing but impatience for my death. The questions that tormented me that night weren't just about their cruelty, but about my own blindness. How had I missed the signs for so long? When had their requests for help transformed into demands and expectations? When had their gratitude disappeared so completely that they could discuss my death like a business opportunity? How many times had they smiled at me while privately calculating how much money my funeral would save them in the long run? I thought about all the times I had defended them to my sister Janet, who had been warning me for years that I was enabling destructive behavior. Janet had watched me drain my savings account again and again to solve their problems, and she had tried to tell me that I was teaching them to see me as an unlimited resource, rather than a person who deserved respect and consideration. "Maddie, you're not helping them by fixing everything," she had said during our last conversation. "You're teaching them that they don't have to be responsible for their choices, because Mom will always bail them out. And you're also teaching them that your needs don't matter, that your financial security is less important than their immediate wants." I had dismissed her concerns as jealousy or misunderstanding. Janet had never had children of her own, and I told myself that she couldn't possibly understand the complex dynamics of parental love and responsibility. I thought she was being harsh and unsympathetic, unable to comprehend the deep satisfaction that came from helping your children succeed in life. Now I realized that Janet had been the only person brave enough to tell me the truth about what I was creating. She had seen what I was too invested to acknowledge, that my children had learned to exploit my love without reciprocating it, that they had been raised to believe that taking from me was not only acceptable but expected. The most devastating part of reading their conversation wasn't just the casual way they discussed my death, but the complete absence of any acknowledgement of what I had given them. There was no recognition of the sacrifices I had made, no appreciation for the opportunities I had provided, no memory of the love I had poured into their lives for over 3 decades. I was simply an obstacle to their financial goals, a problem that death would conveniently solve. As dawn approached, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. I was going to fight back, not with tears or emotional appeals or desperate attempts to make them love me the way I had always loved them. I was going to fight back with the same cold calculation they had used when discussing my death. If they wanted to treat our relationship as a purely financial transaction, then I would show them exactly what that looked like from both sides. They had made it clear that they saw me as nothing more than a source of money and inheritance. Fine. I would remove that source and let them discover what their lives looked like, without the safety net they had taken for granted for so long. They wanted me dead, because it would be financially convenient. Instead, I would show them what it felt like to be financially cut off from someone who was very much alive and finally done with their manipulation. I had spent 34 years teaching them that love meant giving without expecting anything in return. Now I was going to teach them a different lesson entirely. I was going to show them what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the same disregard they had shown me. They thought they would be better off if I were dead. I was about to make them better off broke, and in the process, I was going to rediscover who Maddie Roberts was when she wasn't being slowly consumed by the ungrateful people she had raised. The woman who had read that text message was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous than my children had ever imagined possible. They had awakened something in me that had been dormant for decades, something that had been buried under years of self-sacrifice and unconditional love. They wanted to play games with my life and death. I was about to show them that I was much better at games than they ever suspected, and the stakes were about to become higher than they could possibly imagine. This wasn't going to be about revenge, though I would be lying if I said that wasn't part of it. This was going to be about justice, about consequences, about teaching 3 adults what they should have learned as children. It was about reclaiming my own life and my own worth from people who had spent years systematically devaluing both. Most importantly, it was about discovering whether there was anything left of the woman I used to be before I became a mother. Whether Maddie Roberts had any existence beyond the role that had defined and ultimately nearly destroyed her. The sun was rising outside my bedroom window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that I had refinished myself when money was too tight to hire contractors. Every room in this house held evidence of my resourcefulness, my determination, my willingness to work harder and sacrifice more to create a better life for my family. But now those same rooms would witness something entirely different. They would become the staging ground for the most important battle of my life. A war that would determine whether I spent my remaining years as a victim of my own generosity or as a woman who finally understood that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's enabling, and I was done enabling the people who thought I would be better off dead. The first thing I did that Wednesday morning was call in sick to work. In 37 years of working for the Westfield school district, I had used exactly 12 sick days, and most of those had been when one of my children needed me during some crisis or another. Susan Martinez, the principal, sounded genuinely concerned when I called at 6 in the morning. "Maddie, you never get sick. Are you sure you shouldn't see a doctor?" she asked, and I could hear the worry in her voice. Susan and I had worked together for over a decade, and she knew my patterns better than almost anyone. "I think I just need a day to rest," I told her, which wasn't entirely a lie. I did need rest, but not the kind that comes from sleep. I needed rest from being the person I had been for so long, from carrying the weight of other people's expectations and demands without ever considering my own needs. After hanging up with Susan, I made coffee in the kitchen where I had served thousands of family breakfasts, and I sat at the table where my children had done homework while I helped them with math problems and science projects. The morning light streamed through the windows I had hung curtains in, illuminating the room where I had celebrated their successes and comforted them through their failures. Everything looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, but the emotional landscape had shifted so dramatically that I felt like I was seeing my own life from a great distance. I opened my laptop and began what would become the most thorough investigation I had ever conducted. As a guidance counselor, I had spent decades helping students navigate complex problems by gathering information, analyzing patterns, and developing strategic solutions. Now I was going to apply those same skills to my own situation, treating my children's betrayal like the complex puzzle it was. The first thing I discovered was that I had been far more generous than even I had realized. Going through bank statements and credit card records for the past 5 years revealed a pattern of financial support that was staggering in its scope and consistency. I had been giving each of my children money so regularly that it had become automatic, a monthly transfer that I barely thought about anymore. Marcus received an average of $800 per month in direct deposits, plus additional payments for emergencies, car repairs, and what he called temporary cash flow problems. Over the past 5 years, I had given him nearly $60,000, not counting the money I had spent on his college education or the 2 cars I had bought him when his previous vehicles became unreliable. Tyler's financial dependency was even more extensive because his needs were more erratic and dramatic. Between his failed business ventures, his cryptocurrency losses, and his general inability to manage money responsibly, I had been transferring an average of $1,200 per month to his accounts. The total over 5 years was close to $80,000, and that didn't include the $40,000 in law school loans that I was still paying off on his behalf. Chloe's financial relationship with me was the most sophisticated and manipulative of all. As a nurse, she had a steady income that should have made her financially independent, but she had convinced me that her student loans, her car payment, and her credit card debt were temporary burdens that she needed help managing while she established her career. Every month, I paid her car note, her insurance premiums, and a minimum of $500 toward what she claimed were essential expenses. Over 5 years, she had extracted nearly $70,000 from me, while maintaining the appearance of being the most responsible and grateful of my 3 children. The numbers were devastating. In 5 years, I had given my children over $200,000 in direct financial support, not counting the major expenses like college tuition, cars, and emergency medical bills. $200,000 that could have secured my retirement, allowed me to travel, or simply provided me with the peace of mind that comes from financial security in your golden years. Instead, I had been systematically draining my resources to fund the lifestyle choices of 3 adults who saw my generosity as an entitlement rather than a gift. The most infuriating part was discovering how unnecessary most of their financial crises had been. Marcus worked a good job with a decent salary, but he spent money on expensive restaurants, designer clothes, and luxury vacations that he couldn't afford, and then came to me to cover his basic expenses. Tyler's business failures were the result of impulsive decisions and poor planning, yet he always presented them as investments in our family's future that deserved my financial backing. Chloe was the most manipulative of all because she used her medical knowledge to frame her requests in terms of my health and well-being. "Mom, stress about money isn't good for someone your age," she would say when I hesitated to cover her latest expense. "Let me handle this payment so you don't have to worry about it." She had convinced me that helping her financially was actually a way of taking care of myself, that my role as her mother required me to shield her from the normal financial pressures that every adult faces. As I dug deeper into the financial records, I discovered something even more disturbing. My children had been coordinating their requests to maximize their extraction, while minimizing my ability to see the full scope of what was happening. Marcus would ask for help with car repairs in the same week that Tyler needed emergency rent money, ensuring that I never had time to recover financially before the next crisis hit. Chloe would wait until I had just helped one of her brothers before presenting her own carefully crafted financial emergency. They had turned my love into a weakness that they could exploit with surgical precision. Every birthday card where they expressed gratitude for my support, every holiday gathering where they praised my generosity, Every phone call where they told me what a wonderful mother I was had been part of an elaborate performance designed to keep me emotionally invested in my own financial destruction. The investigation into their text message conversation revealed even more disturbing patterns. Using the family phone plan that I paid for, I was able to access months of their group chat history, and what I found there was a masterclass in manipulation and exploitation. They had been discussing my finances, my health, and my future for over a year, treating me like a resource to be managed, rather than a person who deserved respect and consideration. Mom seemed really tired last week, Chloe had written in March. Maybe we should ease up on the money requests for a little while, so she doesn't start asking questions about why we all need so much help all the time. Good point, Marcus had replied. We don't want her to start thinking we're taking advantage. I'll wait until next month to ask about the credit card thing. Tyler had chimed in with his usual pseudo-psychological analysis. The key is to make sure she feels needed and appreciated. Mom's whole identity is wrapped up in being our provider and protector. As long as we frame our requests in terms of family unity and shared goals, she'll keep helping us. She literally doesn't know how to say no to her children. They had studied my psychology like scientists researching a lab rat, identifying my emotional triggers and exploiting them with calculated precision. Every conversation we had shared, every family dinner where I had felt connected to them, every holiday celebration where I had been proud of our close relationship, had been contaminated by their secret discussions about how to manipulate me more effectively. The cruelest discovery was a conversation from my birthday last month, where they had discussed the gifts they were planning to give me. Instead of expressions of love or appreciation, their messages revealed the transactional nature of how they viewed our relationship. I'm thinking of getting Mom that spa day package, Chloe had written. It's like $200, but if it keeps her happy and generous, it's totally worth the investment. Smart, Marcus had agreed. I was going to get her a gift card to that restaurant she likes. $50 to make her feel appreciated, and she'll probably pay for our next 3 family dinners anyway, so it basically costs me nothing. Even their gifts to me were calculated investments in their ability to extract more money from me in the future. There was no genuine affection behind their gestures, no real desire to make me happy or show me love. Everything was measured against its potential return on investment, its ability to maintain my emotional vulnerability to their manipulation. But the conversation that truly broke my heart was one from Father's Day, when they had discussed how to handle the fact that their father had never been part of their lives. Instead of acknowledging the sacrifices I had made to be both mother and father to them, they had focused on how to use his absence as emotional leverage against me. Mom always gets weird around Father's Day, Tyler had observed. She feels guilty that we didn't have a dad, so she overcompensates by being extra generous. It's actually the perfect time to ask for big-ticket items because she's already feeling like she owes us something. True, Chloe had responded. Remember when I got her to buy me that car? I just mentioned how hard it must have been for her to teach me to drive without a husband to help, and she started crying and wrote me a check the next day. They had weaponized my guilt about their father's abandonment, using my deepest insecurities about single parenthood as a tool to extract resources from me. The pain I had carried for decades about their father walking away, the worry that I hadn't been enough for them, the fear that they had been damaged by growing up without a male role model, all of it had been turned into ammunition they could use against me whenever they needed money. Reading these conversations was like watching a nature documentary about predators stalking their prey. Every kindness I had shown them, every vulnerability I had shared, every moment of genuine emotion, had been cataloged and analyzed for its potential utility in their ongoing campaign to drain me financially and emotionally. The medical discussions were perhaps the most chilling of all. Chloe's nursing background had given her insights into aging and health issues that she shared with her brothers in disturbing detail. They had discussed my blood pressure medication, speculated about my life expectancy, and even researched the signs of early dementia so they could recognize if my mental faculties began to decline. The good news is that Mom's in pretty good health for her age, Chloe had written in a message from last summer. Bad news is that means she could live another 20 or 30 years, which really screws up our financial planning. We need to be more aggressive about getting her to liquidate assets now, while she's still making rational decisions. They had been monitoring my health not out of concern for my well-being, but to calculate how much time they had to extract wealth from me before I became incapacitated or died. My longevity was a problem to be solved, my continued vitality an obstacle to their financial goals. The conversations also revealed the extent to which they had been researching my financial situation without my knowledge. They knew about my retirement accounts, my life insurance policies, the value of my house, and even my monthly expenses. Somehow, they had gained access to information that should have been private, and they had been using that knowledge to plan their inheritance strategy while I was still very much alive. Mom's 401k is worth about $200,000 now, Marcus had written in a conversation from August. If she keeps withdrawing money to help us, that number is going to keep shrinking. We need to convince her to stop dipping into retirement savings and start liquidating other assets instead. The house is the obvious choice, Tyler had agreed. $300,000 in equity just sitting there while we're all struggling with debt. It's actually irresponsible of her not to access that money when it could solve all of our problems. They had been treating my financial portfolio like a family business that they had every right to reorganize according to their needs and preferences. My retirement security, my housing stability, my peace of mind in old age were all secondary considerations compared to their immediate desire for debt relief and lifestyle enhancement. The most sophisticated part of their manipulation was how they had divided responsibilities for managing me. Marcus handled the guilt-based approaches, reminding me constantly of how hard he worked and how unfair it was that he had to struggle financially despite his college education. Tyler specialized in crisis management, creating dramatic emergencies that required immediate financial intervention. Chloe focused on health and family unity, framing her requests in terms of what was best for all of us, and using her medical knowledge to make me worry about stress and aging. They had turned the exploitation of their mother into a coordinated campaign with specialized roles and strategic objectives. I wasn't a person to them, I was a target, and they had spent years perfecting their techniques for extracting maximum value from my love and guilt and fear. As I sat in my kitchen reading through months of these conversations, I felt something shift inside my chest. The hurt and betrayal were still there, but they were being joined by something much more powerful and energizing. Anger was rising like a tide, but it wasn't the destructive, chaotic anger that leads to screaming matches and broken relationships. This was cold, calculating fury that sharpened my mind and clarified my priorities. My children had made a crucial mistake in their psychological analysis of me. They had assumed that my generosity and selflessness were signs of weakness, that my willingness to sacrifice for them meant I was incapable of protecting myself when necessary. They had confused kindness with stupidity, love with vulnerability. What they didn't understand was that the same intelligence and determination that had allowed me to raise 3 children as a single mother, to build a successful career in education, and to maintain a household and family for over 30 years, could be directed toward very different goals when the situation required it. They thought they knew who Maddie Roberts was because they had only seen the maternal version of me, the woman whose entire identity had been shaped by her love for them. But there had been a Maddie Roberts before I became a mother, a woman who had navigated college and graduate school on her own, who had built a career and bought a house and created a life without depending on anyone else for financial or emotional support. That woman had been dormant for 3 decades, buried under the demands of motherhood and the constant pressure of trying to be everything my children needed. Now she was waking up, and she was not nearly as defenseless as my children imagined. I spent the rest of that Wednesday creating what I privately called my evidence file, a comprehensive documentation of everything I had discovered. Every text message, every financial transaction, every instance of manipulation and exploitation was carefully cataloged and organized. As a guidance counselor, I had learned that successful problem-solving required thorough preparation and clear objectives. My objective was becoming clearer with every piece of evidence I uncovered. I was going to teach my children what consequences looked like. Not the gentle, loving consequences that I had failed to impose during their childhood, but the harsh, unforgiving consequences that the real world imposed on adults who made destructive choices. They wanted to treat our relationship as a purely financial transaction? Fine. I would show them what happened when that transaction was terminated. They wanted to discuss my death as a solution to their money problems? Perfect. I would give them a taste of what their lives would look like without me, not as a corpse who had left them an inheritance, but as a living woman who had finally learned to value herself appropriately. The planning phase was exhilarating in a way that I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in decades, I was focused entirely on my own needs and goals rather than trying to anticipate and meet the demands of other people. Every decision I made was based on what would benefit me, what would protect my interests, what would create the future I wanted rather than the future my children expected me to provide for them. I started by researching my legal options. As it turned out, there were no laws requiring me to financially support my adult children. No regulations that prevented me from changing my will or restructuring my financial accounts. Everything I had been giving them had been voluntary, which meant everything I planned to take away would be entirely within my rights. The inheritance that they had been counting on, the life insurance policies that they had factored into their financial planning, the house that they expected to inherit, all of it was mine to do with as I pleased. And what pleased me was the idea of teaching them what genuine financial independence looked like. I made appointments with my bank, my financial advisor, and my lawyer for the following week. By the end of the month, my children were going to discover that the woman they had been manipulating and exploiting for years was much more formidable than they had ever imagined. They thought they were playing a game with someone who didn't understand the rules. They were about to learn that I had been letting them win, and that game was officially over. The meeting with my financial advisor, Patricia Chen, took place on a crisp Thursday morning in November. Patricia had been managing my retirement accounts for over 15 years, and she greeted me with the warm familiarity of someone who had watched me navigate every major financial decision of my adult life. Her office overlooked the downtown business district, and as I sat across from her mahogany desk, I felt like I was stepping into a version of myself that I had forgotten existed. "Maddie, what can I do for you today?" Patricia asked, pulling up my accounts on her computer screen. "Are you thinking about adjusting your retirement timeline? You've got some good options here." "I want to make some significant changes to my financial structure," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "I need to restructure my accounts in ways that will protect my assets and ensure my financial security for the rest of my life." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "Of course. What specifically are you thinking about?" I had rehearsed this conversation during the drive to her office, but speaking the words aloud still felt surreal. "I want to remove my children as beneficiaries from all of my accounts and life insurance policies. I want to establish a revocable trust that gives me complete control over my assets while I'm alive. And I want to explore options for protecting my house from any potential claims or demands." The silence that followed was profound. Patricia had known my children since they were young adults, had watched me make countless financial sacrifices to support their education and their various life crises. She had been the one to help me restructure my retirement contributions when I took out the second mortgage to pay for Tyler's study abroad program. She had counseled me through the difficult decision to cash out part of my 401k when Marcus needed emergency dental work that his insurance wouldn't cover. "Maddie," she said carefully, "this represents a pretty dramatic shift from the estate planning we've discussed in the past. Can you help me understand what's motivating these changes?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder containing printed copies of some of the most damaging text message conversations. "I've discovered that my children have been planning my financial life around the assumption that I'll die soon enough for them to inherit assets that will solve their various money problems. They've also been systematically manipulating me to extract as much money as possible while I'm still alive." Patricia read through the messages with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades helping people navigate complex family financial dynamics. Her expression grew more serious with each page, and when she finally looked up, there was a hardness in her eyes that I had never seen before. "This is deeply disturbing," she said quietly. "I've seen family conflicts over money before, but this level of calculation and manipulation is unusual. How long has this been going on?" "Based on what I've uncovered, at least 3 years of explicit planning, but probably much longer in terms of the actual financial manipulation," I replied. "They've extracted over $200,000 from me in the past 5 years alone, and they've been coordinating their requests to maximize their take while minimizing my ability to see the full scope of what was happening." Patricia leaned back in her chair, processing what I had told her. The changes you're proposing would effectively cut them off from any future inheritance and remove their ability to make claims on your estate. Are you prepared for the family conflict that's likely to result from this? They've already created the family conflict, I said. I'm just finally responding to it appropriately. Over the next 2 hours, Patricia and I restructured my entire financial life. The revocable trust would protect my assets, while giving me complete control over how they were managed and distributed. My retirement accounts were modified to name the trust as the primary beneficiary, with specific instructions that would prevent my children from accessing any funds until they met certain conditions that I seriously doubted they would ever be willing or able to fulfill. The life insurance policies were the most satisfying changes to make. The policies that my children had been counting on to solve their financial problems were redirected to benefit several charities that I had supported over the years, along with a scholarship fund for single mothers pursuing education degrees. If my children wanted to benefit from my death, they would have to do it by becoming the kind of people who deserved support, rather than simply waiting for me to die. There's one more thing I want to discuss, I told Patricia as we wrapped up the paperwork. I want to establish a separate checking account that my children don't know about, and I want to transfer enough money into it to cover my living expenses for at least 2 years. I have a feeling that my relationship with them is going to become complicated very quickly. Patricia nodded approvingly. That's very wise. Financial independence is the foundation of every other kind of independence. How much are you thinking about transferring? We settled on $60,000, enough to cover my mortgage, utilities, groceries, and other essential expenses for an extended period without needing to touch my retirement accounts or ask anyone for help. The account would be at a different bank, with statements sent to a post office box that I rented that afternoon. The next stop was my attorney's office. Richard Martinez had handled my legal needs for over a decade, from my divorce proceedings to estate planning updates. He was a thoughtful man in his late 50s who had built his practice around helping ordinary people navigate life's major transitions and challenges. Maddie, good to see you, Richard said as I settled into the familiar leather chair across from his desk. Patricia Chen called and gave me a general overview of what you're hoping to accomplish. I have to say, I'm both impressed by your thoroughness and concerned about the family situation that's precipitated this. I need to protect myself legally from people who see me as a financial resource rather than a family member, I said. What are my options? Richard pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes as I explained the full scope of what I had discovered. He asked detailed questions about the text messages, the financial manipulation, and my children's access to information about my assets. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes, apparently thinking through the legal implications. The good news is that you have significant legal protections available, he finally said. Your children have no legal claim to your assets while you're alive, and you have complete discretion over how you structure your estate planning. The bad news is that some of the behaviors you've described could potentially rise to the level of elder financial abuse, which might require us to consider more aggressive legal protections. Elder financial abuse. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, even though I had intellectually understood that what my children were doing constituted abuse. Hearing it described in legal terms made the reality more stark and undeniable. What would those protections look like, I asked. We could establish legal safeguards that would prevent them from accessing your financial information, restrict their ability to influence your financial decisions, and create documentation that would protect you if they ever tried to claim that you were mentally incompetent or being influenced by outside parties, Richard explained. Essentially, we'd be creating a legal paper trail that demonstrates your mental competency and your deliberate choice to restructure your relationship with them. Over the next 3 hours, Richard and I created what he called a comprehensive asset protection strategy. The new will explicitly disinherited my children while explaining in detail why I had made that choice, including specific references to their manipulation and financial exploitation. The document was thorough enough that any legal challenge would require them to essentially argue that their own documented behavior hadn't actually happened. We also established a durable power of attorney that specifically excluded my children from any decision-making authority over my finances or health care. Instead, I named my sister Janet as my advocate, along with Patricia Chen as a secondary financial decision-maker if Janet was unavailable. "This is some of the most thorough asset protection work I've ever done," Richard said as we reviewed the final documents. "Your children would need to prove that you were mentally incompetent at the time you signed these documents, and frankly, the evidence suggests exactly the opposite. You've approached this situation with remarkable clarity and strategic thinking." The final step in my legal preparation was the most emotionally difficult, writing letters to each of my children that would be delivered only in the event of my death. These letters explained exactly why they had been removed from my will and what they could have done differently to maintain a relationship with me. I wanted them to understand that their disinheritance wasn't the result of a momentary anger or a misunderstanding, but the natural consequence of years of deliberate exploitation. "Marcus," I wrote in his letter, "you spent your adult life treating me like a personal bank account, rather than a person who deserved respect and consideration. You coordinated with your siblings to manipulate my emotions and extract money from me while showing no genuine appreciation or love. When you receive this letter, I will be gone, and you will finally have the financial independence you claimed to want. I hope you learn to value it more than you ever valued me." Each letter was different, tailored to the specific ways that each child had betrayed my trust and exploited my love. Writing them was cathartic in a way that surprised me, allowing me to articulate clearly what they had done and why it was unacceptable. The letters would serve as my final communication with them, ensuring that they understood exactly why their inheritance dreams had turned into nightmares. By Friday afternoon, I had completely restructured my financial and legal life in ways that would have been unimaginable just a week earlier. My assets were protected, my estate plans were revised, and my legal vulnerabilities were minimized. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in complete control of my own destiny. But the most important changes weren't financial or legal. They were psychological. Sitting in my kitchen that evening, reviewing the documents that would reshape my children's futures, I felt a sense of power and agency that I hadn't experienced since before they were born. I wasn't a victim anymore, waiting passively for the next crisis or manipulation. I was a strategist, someone who could identify problems and implement solutions with precision and effectiveness. The weekend passed quietly as I prepared for what I knew would be the most difficult conversations of my life. I rehearsed various scenarios, anticipating how each of my children would react to the news that their financial safety net had been permanently removed. Marcus would likely become angry and accusatory, Tyler would probably try to negotiate and manipulate, and Chloe would almost certainly attempt to use her medical knowledge to suggest that I was having some kind of mental health crisis. None of their predictable responses concerned me anymore. I had spent 3 days creating an unshakable legal and financial foundation for my decision. They could rage, manipulate, and gaslight all they wanted, but the fundamental reality wouldn't change. Their inheritance was gone, their monthly financial support was ending, and their ability to exploit my love had been permanently severed. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood as I prepared to confront the people who had betrayed me most deeply. I had decided to handle each conversation separately, starting with Marcus, since he was generally the most aggressive and direct in his approach to family conflict. The phone call was scheduled for 10 o'clock, giving me time to review my notes and prepare myself emotionally for what was coming. As I dialed his number, I felt remarkably calm, centered in a way that reminded me of how I used to feel before difficult meetings with parents or administrators at school. This was just another problem that required professional handling and clear communication. "Hey, Mom," Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the slightly impatient tone that had become his default when talking to me. "What's up? I'm pretty busy this morning. I need to talk to you about some changes I'm making to my financial situation," I said, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "Changes that will affect you directly." There was a pause, and I could hear Marcus shifting in his chair. "Okay, what kind of changes?" "I've removed you and your siblings as beneficiaries from my will, my life insurance policies, and my retirement accounts," I said calmly. "I've also discontinued all financial support that I've been providing to you. No more monthly transfers, no more emergency assistance, no more help with your various expenses." The silence that followed was so complete that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was tight with disbelief. Mom, what are you talking about? Are you feeling okay? This doesn't sound like you at all. It sounds exactly like me, I replied. It just doesn't sound like the version of me that you've been manipulating for the past several years. Manipulating? Mom, I think you might need to see a doctor. You're talking crazy. I had expected this response, the immediate attempt to gaslight me into questioning my own perceptions and decisions. Marcus, I've read your text messages with Tyler and Chloe. I know about your group chat where you discuss my finances and plan your inheritance strategy. I know that you've been coordinating your financial requests to maximize what you can extract from me. Another long silence, followed by what sounded like Marcus dropping his phone. When he came back on the line, his voice had changed completely, losing the patronizing concern and becoming sharp with panic. Mom, those messages, they're not what they seem like. We were just worried about your financial security, trying to make sure you had everything you needed. You were worried about my financial security? I asked, allowing a note of incredulity to enter my voice. Is that why you wrote that I'd be better off dead so you could inherit my assets without having to wait for me to spend them on my own living expenses? I never said that, Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually, it was Chloe who said that, but you and Tyler both agreed with her assessment, I replied. You spent years treating me like an obstacle to your financial goals, rather than a person who deserves love and respect. Now you get to discover what your life looks like without my financial support. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus cycling through denial, anger, bargaining, and threats. He accused me of being mentally unstable, financially irresponsible, and cruel to my own children. He threatened to contest my will, to have me declared incompetent, to sue me for emotional distress. Each threat only confirmed that I had made the right decision. This wasn't the voice of a loving son who was concerned about his mother's well-being. This was the voice of someone whose primary source of income had just been eliminated, someone who was panicking about having to support himself without external assistance. Marcus, I said when his tirade finally exhausted itself, you're 21 years old with a college degree and a good job. You'll be fine without my money. You just might have to live within your means for the first time in your adult life. Mom, please, he said, and for the first time in the conversation, he sounded genuinely vulnerable. I know we haven't always been perfect children, but we love you. We're family. You can't just cut us off like this. You cut me off emotionally years ago, I replied. I'm just matching your energy. If you want to rebuild a relationship with me, you're welcome to try, but it will have to be based on genuine affection and respect rather than financial dependency. After hanging up with Marcus, I sat in my kitchen for several minutes, processing how the conversation had unfolded. His responses had been exactly what I had anticipated: denial, manipulation, threats, and finally desperate bargaining. What struck me most was the complete absence of any genuine remorse or acknowledgement of how his behavior had affected me. Even when confronted with direct evidence of his exploitation, his primary concern was maintaining access to my money rather than repairing our relationship. The call with Tyler an hour later followed a similar pattern, though his approach was more psychologically sophisticated. As someone who had spent 2 years in law school before dropping out, Tyler had a better understanding of manipulation tactics and legal concepts. Mom, I understand that you're upset about something, he began after I explained the changes I had made. But making major financial decisions when you're emotionally distressed isn't a good idea. Why don't we take some time to cool off and then sit down together to talk through whatever's bothering you? I'm not emotionally distressed, I replied. I'm responding rationally to information that I've discovered about how my children really view me and our relationship. Tyler tried a different approach, attempting to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding that could be resolved through better communication. Mom, if we said something that hurt your feelings, we can talk about that. But changing your will and cutting off financial support seems like a pretty extreme reaction to a family miscommunication. Reading detailed discussions about how much easier your lives would be if I died isn't a miscommunication, I said. It's a revelation about how you actually see me. The conversation with Tyler lasted longer than the one with Marcus because Tyler was more skilled at emotional manipulation. He tried to make me feel guilty about abandoning my children in their time of need, appealed to my identity as a loving mother, and suggested that I was being influenced by outside parties who didn't understand our family dynamics. None of his tactics worked because I had spent days preparing for exactly these responses. Every argument he made, every emotional appeal he attempted, every manipulation tactic he employed had been anticipated and analyzed. I responded to each one with calm facts and clear boundaries. "Tyler, you're 29 years old," I said as the conversation wound down. "You dropped out of law school on my dime and have spent the last 5 years jumping from one failed business venture to another while I covered your basic expenses. Maybe it's time for you to learn what genuine financial responsibility looks like." The call with Chloe was scheduled for that evening, giving me time to decompress and prepare for what I expected to be the most challenging conversation of all. Chloe was the most emotionally intelligent of my 3 children, and I knew she would use her nursing background to suggest that I was experiencing some kind of mental health crisis or age-related cognitive decline. When 8 o'clock arrived, I was ready for her. I had spent the afternoon reviewing my documentation one more time, ensuring that I could respond to any challenge she might raise about my mental competency or decision-making capacity. "Hi, Mom," Chloe said when she answered the phone, her voice already carrying a note of concern that sounded rehearsed. "Marcus and Tyler called me today. They're really worried about you. They said you've made some pretty dramatic changes to your financial planning." "I have," I confirmed. "I've restructured my estate to reflect the reality of our family relationships rather than the fantasy one had been maintaining." "Mom, that sounds really concerning," Chloe said, slipping into what I recognized as her professional bedside manner. "Making major life decisions when you're under stress isn't healthy for someone your age. Have you been feeling depressed lately? Are you having trouble sleeping?" I had to admire her technique. She was attempting to pathologize my decision-making while positioning herself as the concerned healthcare professional who was looking out for my well-being. It was manipulation disguised as medical care, and it might have worked if I hadn't been prepared for it. "Chloe, I'm not depressed or mentally impaired," I said calmly. "I'm responding appropriately to discovering that my children have been exploiting my love and generosity while secretly planning my financial life around the assumption that I'll die soon enough to solve their money problems." "Mom, I think you might be misinterpreting some things," Chloe said, but there was less confidence in her voice now. "Sometimes when we're feeling isolated or disconnected, we can read too much into casual conversations." "I have screenshots of months of your group chat conversations," I replied, "including the ones where you research my life expectancy and discuss how to manipulate my emotions more effectively. I also have 5 years of financial records showing exactly how much money each of you has extracted from me." The silence that followed was different from the pauses in my conversations with her brothers. This wasn't shock or panic, but the silence of someone who was rapidly recalculating their strategy. "Mom," Chloe said finally, "even if we haven't always communicated perfectly, we're still your children. Cutting us off financially isn't going to solve whatever problems you think exist in our relationships." "You're right," I agreed. "Cutting you off financially won't solve the problems in our relationships, but it will solve the problem of my resources being systematically drained by people who see my death as a financial opportunity." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Chloe cycling through various approaches: medical concern, emotional manipulation, logical argumentation, and finally desperate pleading. Like her brothers, she showed no genuine remorse for her behavior and no acknowledgement that what they had been doing constituted exploitation and abuse. By the time I hung up the phone, I felt emotionally drained but psychologically liberated. I had confronted the 3 people who had betrayed me most deeply, and I had maintained my composure and my resolve throughout each difficult conversation. They now understood that their financial safety net was gone forever, and that any future relationship with me would have to be built on genuine respect rather than calculated manipulation. The house felt different that night, quieter, but not empty. For the first time in years, I was living entirely for myself, making decisions based on my own needs and values, rather than trying to anticipate and meet the demands of people who had never appreciated my sacrifices. The silence wasn't lonely. It was peaceful, the sound of a woman who had finally learned to value herself appropriately. As I prepared for bed, I realized that this was only the beginning. My children would not accept their disinheritance quietly, and I needed to be prepared for whatever they might attempt next. But for tonight, it was enough to know that I had finally stopped enabling their exploitation and started protecting my own interests. The woman who had read that devastating text message a week ago was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous to people who mistook kindness for weakness. My children had awakened something in me that they were not equipped to handle, and they were about to discover just how formidable their mother could be when she finally decided to fight back. The retaliation began exactly 72 hours after my final phone call with Chloe. I was sitting in my living room on Thursday evening, reading a novel I had ordered online, when my doorbell rang insistently. Through the peephole, I could see all three of my children standing on my front porch, their faces grim with determination. Marcus was holding what looked like a manila folder, Tyler had his laptop bag slung over his shoulder, and Chloe was carrying a small bouquet of flowers that I immediately recognized as a prop designed to make their visit appear loving and concerned. I took a deep breath, checked that my phone was recording as I had planned, and opened the door with the calm expression I had been practicing in the mirror. "Hello," I said simply, not inviting them in or showing any surprise at their coordinated appearance. "Mom, we need to talk," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he had learned to use in business meetings. "We've been doing some research, and we think you might be the victim of elder financial abuse. Someone has been influencing you to make decisions that aren't in your best interest." I almost laughed at the irony. My children, who had spent years systematically manipulating me to extract money, were now accusing imaginary third parties of the exact behavior they had been engaging in themselves. "Please come in," I said, stepping aside. "I'm curious to hear your theory." They filed into my living room and arranged themselves like a legal team preparing to present a case. Marcus sat in the center of my couch, Tyler positioned himself in the chair closest to where I would sit, and Chloe remained standing, the better to use her height and medical authority to intimidate me. "Mom, sit down," Chloe said in her professional nurse voice. "We're worried about some changes in your behavior and decision-making that could indicate you're being taken advantage of by someone." I sat in my favorite armchair, the one that gave me the best view of all three of them, and waited for their presentation to begin. Marcus opened his folder and pulled out what appeared to be printed articles from the internet. "Mom, we've been researching elder financial abuse, and you're showing several warning signs. Sudden changes to estate planning, secretive behavior about money, making large financial decisions without consulting family members." "Interesting," I said. "Tell me more about these warning signs." Tyler jumped in with his pseudo-psychological analysis. "The profile fits perfectly, Mom. Elderly people who become isolated or feel disconnected from their families are prime targets for financial predators. Someone has obviously convinced you that your own children are trying to take advantage of you, when actually we're the people who care about you most. And who do you think is manipulating me?" I asked, genuinely curious about how elaborate their delusion had become. "It could be anyone," Chloe said, moving closer to my chair. "A new friend, someone at work, even a professional like your financial advisor or lawyer. These people are very skilled at gaining trust, and then slowly turning their victims against their own families." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering their theory. "So you believe that someone has convinced me to restructure my finances and change my will by making me think that my children don't really love me?" "Exactly," Marcus said, relief evident in his voice that I seemed to be understanding their explanation. "Mom, we love you. We've always loved you. The idea that we would want you to die, or that we see you as just a source of money, is insane. Someone has poisoned your mind against us." The sincerity in his voice was almost convincing, except that I had spent the past week reading their actual written conversations about my death and their inheritance plans. Watching them perform concern and love while knowing exactly what they really thought of me was like watching actors in a play where I had already read the script. "I appreciate your concern," I said calmly, "but I haven't been influenced by anyone except the evidence of your own words and actions. Would you like to see some of that evidence?" I reached for my own folder, which contained printed copies of their most damaging text message conversations. As I spread the pages on my coffee table, I watched their expressions change from confident concern to growing panic. These are from your group chat, I explained conversationally. Here's the conversation where Chloe suggests that you'd all be better off if I wasn't around anymore. Here's the one where you discuss my life expectancy and how to manipulate my emotions more effectively. And this one is particularly interesting. It's where you calculate how much inheritance you'll lose if I live too long and spend my own money on my own expenses. The silence in the room was profound. Tyler was staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Marcus had gone pale, and Chloe was slowly backing away from my chair as if I had suddenly become dangerous. Where did you get these? Chloe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. From your phones, I replied. The phones on the family plan that I pay for. Amazing what you can access when you're actually the account holder. Marcus recovered first, shifting into damage control mode. Mom, those messages were taken out of context. We were just worried about your financial future, trying to make sure you had enough money for your retirement. Maybe some of our wording was insensitive, but our intentions were good. Were your intentions good when you coordinated your financial requests to make sure I never had time to recover between crises? I asked. Was it concern for my well-being when you researched the symptoms of dementia so you could recognize if I was becoming mentally incapacitated? Tyler tried a different approach. Mom, even if we haven't always communicated perfectly, cutting us off completely isn't the solution. We can work on our relationship, go to family therapy, learn to communicate better. That's an interesting offer, I said. What would you be willing to give up to repair our relationship? The question caught them off guard. They looked at each other uncertainly, clearly not having anticipated that I might have conditions for reconciliation. What do you mean? Chloe asked. I mean that rebuilding trust requires sacrifice from the people who violated that trust, I explained. You've taken over $200,000 from me in the past 5 years, while secretly planning your lives around my death. What are you willing to give back to demonstrate that you're serious about changing? The suggestion of returning money they had already spent clearly horrified them. Marcus started to speak, stopped, tried again, and finally fell silent. Tyler stared at his hands. Chloe resumed her medical authority approach. Mom, asking us to pay back money that you gave us voluntarily isn't realistic. We've built our lives around the help you provided, and we can't just undo years of financial planning overnight. But you expected me to undo years of estate planning overnight when you decided I was living too long and spending too much of your inheritance, I pointed out. They stayed for another hour, cycling through various strategies to convince me to restore their financial support and their inheritance rights. They tried guilt, claiming that other families didn't operate the way I was demanding. They tried fear, suggesting that I would die alone and unloved if I persisted in punishing them for minor communication problems. They tried bargaining, offering to call me more often or visit more regularly in exchange for reversing my financial decisions. None of their approaches acknowledged the fundamental issue. They had spent years treating me like a resource to be exploited, rather than a person who deserved love and respect. Even now, faced with clear evidence of their manipulation, they were focused on minimizing the consequences, rather than taking responsibility for their behavior. When they finally left that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: complete emotional clarity about my children. The last traces of guilt and self-doubt that had been lingering since I discovered their betrayal were gone. They had shown me exactly who they were when they thought they could manipulate me back into compliance, and they had confirmed that my decision to protect myself had been absolutely correct. The legal challenges began the following week. Richard Martinez called me on Monday morning to inform me that my children had contacted a lawyer about contesting my new will and exploring options for having me declared mentally incompetent to make financial decisions. They're claiming that your recent changes to your estate planning represent a dramatic departure from your previous wishes and could indicate diminished mental capacity, Richard explained. They want to have you evaluated by a court-appointed psychiatrist. How strong is their case? I asked. Essentially non-existent, Richard replied with satisfaction. The documentation we prepared anticipated exactly this challenge. We have evidence of your mental competency, clear explanations for your decisions, and most importantly, we have their own text messages proving that your concerns about their motivations were completely justified. The psychiatric evaluation took place 3 weeks later in a sterile office downtown. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a direct manner that reminded me of the best colleagues I had worked with during my teaching career. Mrs. Roberts, I understand that your children have expressed concerns about some recent financial decisions you've made, she began. Can you tell me about those decisions and what motivated them? For the next 2 hours, I walked Dr. Morrison through everything I had discovered about my children's manipulation and exploitation. I showed her the text message conversations, explained the pattern of coordinated financial requests, and described the systematic way they had been planning my financial life around their inheritance expectations. Dr. Morrison asked detailed questions about my mental state, my decision-making process, and my understanding of the consequences of my actions. She tested my memory, my reasoning ability, and my emotional stability. By the end of the evaluation, she was looking at me with something approaching admiration. Mrs. Roberts, I have to tell you that this is one of the clearest cases of appropriate boundary setting that I've encountered in my practice, she said. Your children's behavior constitutes a textbook example of financial elder abuse, and your response demonstrates remarkable mental clarity and emotional strength. Her official report, which Richard shared with me the following week, was a masterpiece of professional vindication. Dr. Morrison found me to be completely mentally competent, emotionally stable, and entirely justified in my decision to protect my assets from family members who had been systematically exploiting my generosity. Mrs. Roberts has demonstrated exceptional insight into a complex family dynamic and has responded with appropriate protective measures, the report concluded. Her recent financial decisions reflect sound judgment and careful planning, rather than any diminished mental capacity. The legal challenge collapsed immediately. When faced with a psychiatric evaluation that completely supported my mental competency and text message evidence that proved their exploitation, my children's lawyer advised them to drop their case rather than face the public embarrassment of having their manipulation tactics exposed in court. But my children weren't finished trying to regain access to my money. When legal challenges failed, they shifted to a campaign of emotional manipulation that was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. The first phase involved Marcus attempting to use his young daughter, my only grandchild, as leverage against me. 7-year-old Emma had always been the light of my life, a sweet child who had inherited none of her father's manipulative tendencies. Marcus began calling me with updates about Emma's school activities, her piano lessons, and her questions about why Grandma wasn't visiting anymore. She misses you, Mom, Marcus would say during these calls. She doesn't understand why you're not part of her life anymore. She asks me if Grandma doesn't love her anymore. The emotional blackmail was expertly crafted. Marcus knew that my relationship with Emma was one of the few purely positive connections in my family, and he was deliberately weaponizing that relationship to pressure me into restoring his financial support. But I had learned to recognize manipulation in all its forms, and I responded by contacting my daughter-in-law directly. Sarah had always been kind to me, and I suspected that she was unaware of the full scope of Marcus's financial manipulation. Sarah, I need you to understand something important, I told her during our phone conversation. My relationship with Marcus has become very complicated because of some financial issues, but that has nothing to do with my feelings for Emma. I would love to maintain a relationship with her if that's possible, without enabling Marcus's manipulation. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Maddie, I have to be honest with you. I've been concerned about how much money Marcus has been getting from you. We make a good living, but he's always telling me that he needs help from his mother for various expenses. I didn't realize you were supporting him as much as you apparently have been. That conversation led to an arrangement where I could spend time with Emma directly, without going through Marcus. Sarah understood that I was protecting myself from financial abuse, and she respected my decision while ensuring that Emma didn't lose her relationship with her grandmother. When the emotional blackmail involving Emma failed, my children shifted to a more direct approach: financial retaliation. Tyler, who still had access to some old financial documents from when I had helped him with business loan applications, used that information to contact my bank and my credit card companies, claiming that I was mentally incompetent and might be making unauthorized transactions. The resulting freeze on my accounts was temporary but infuriating. I spent an entire day on the phone with customer service representatives. providing documentation of my mental competency and proving that Tyler had no legal authority to interfere with my finances. Richard Martinez immediately sent Tyler a cease and desist letter threatening legal action if he continued to interfere with my financial accounts. "What your son did constitutes harassment and potentially fraud," Richard told me. "If he tries anything like this again, we can have him arrested." Chloe's retaliation was the most psychologically sophisticated. As a nurse, she had access to my medical information through family connections at the hospital where I received care. She began calling my doctors to express concern about my mental state, suggesting that I might be experiencing early-stage dementia or depression that was affecting my judgment. The calls created a flurry of concerned outreach from my healthcare providers, who scheduled appointments to evaluate my mental and emotional well-being. While the evaluations ultimately confirmed my competency, the process was exhausting and invasive. More seriously, Chloe used her medical knowledge to research my prescription medications and began spreading rumors among extended family members that I was probably over-medicated or experiencing dangerous drug interactions that were affecting my judgment. The whisper campaign was effective enough that my sister Janet called me in genuine concern. "Maddie, Chloe called me last week and said she was worried that your blood pressure medication might be causing confusion or memory problems. She said that could explain why you've been making such unusual decisions lately." "Janet, I'm on the same blood pressure medication I've been taking for 5 years, I replied. "My blood pressure is fine, my memory is fine, and my decision-making is better than it's ever been." Chloe is trying to undermine my credibility because she's lost access to my money. Janet was quiet for a moment. When she called me, something felt off about the conversation. She kept asking about your financial situation and whether you had been talking to me about changing your will. I thought it was strange that she seemed more interested in your money than your health. The campaign of retaliation continued for months, with my children taking turns attempting different strategies to pressure me into restoring their financial benefits. They tried involving other family members, spreading rumors about my mental state, and even attempting to contact my employer to suggest that I was too unstable to work with students. Each attack only strengthened my resolve. Watching my children systematically try to destroy my reputation, my relationships, and my peace of mind in pursuit of money confirmed that I had made the right decision in cutting them off. These weren't the actions of loving children who were concerned about their mother's well-being. These were the actions of financial predators who were furious that their primary target had finally learned to protect herself. The turning point came almost a year after I had first discovered their text message conversations. Marcus, facing genuine financial pressure for the first time in his adult life, made a mistake that finally exposed the full scope of their planning to the rest of our family. During a family gathering at my sister's house for Christmas, Marcus had too much to drink and began complaining loudly about my selfishness in cutting off his inheritance. In front of aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends, he delivered a bitter monologue about how I was hoarding money that rightfully belonged to my children. "She's got hundreds of thousands of dollars just sitting there while her own son struggles to pay his bills," Marcus said, his voice slurred with alcohol and resentment. "It's not like she needs all that money. She's 63 years old. She's probably only got 20 years left at most, and she's going to waste all of it on herself, instead of helping her family." The room fell silent. Extended family members who had been hearing rumors about my mental state and unusual behavior were suddenly getting a glimpse of the entitled, manipulative person that Marcus really was. His drunken rant revealed exactly what he thought of me, not as a person with the right to control her own resources, but as a temporary custodian of money that belonged to him. My cousin Patricia, who was close to my age and had always been protective of me, spoke up first. "Marcus, are you seriously complaining that your mother won't give you her money? You're a grown man with a job and a family. Why do you think you're entitled to your mother's savings?" Marcus tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. Other family members began asking pointed questions about the financial support I had been providing and the circumstances that had led me to cut it off. When Janet shared some of the text message conversations that I had shown her, the family's perception of the situation shifted completely. By the end of the evening, it was Marcus, Tyler, and Chloe who were being viewed with suspicion and disapproval, not me. Family members who had been concerned about my mental state were now appalled by my children's sense of entitlement and their calculated manipulation. The social consequences for my children were swift and significant. Extended family members who had previously been sympathetic to their financial struggles now understood that those struggles were largely self-created, and that they had been exploiting my generosity for years. Invitations to family gatherings became scarce. Phone calls from relatives stopped. The social support network that they had taken for granted began to evaporate. More importantly, their own relationships with each other began to deteriorate under the pressure of their failed manipulation campaign. Without access to my money, they started competing with each other for the limited financial resources available to them. Tyler accused Marcus of selfishly focusing on his own needs rather than developing a coordinated strategy to regain access to my accounts. Chloe blamed both of her brothers for alienating me with their heavy-handed tactics. The group chat that had once been used to coordinate their exploitation of me became a forum for bitter accusations and recriminations. Reading their increasingly hostile messages to each other was almost as satisfying as discovering their original betrayal had been devastating. Meanwhile, my own life was flourishing in ways I hadn't experienced in decades. Without the constant financial drain of supporting 3 adult children, I was able to pursue interests and opportunities that I had been postponing for years. I enrolled in the master's degree program in psychology that I had always wanted to pursue, taking evening classes at the local university. At 63, I was one of the older students in the program, but my life experience and professional background as a guidance counselor gave me insights that my younger classmates found valuable. The intellectual stimulation of graduate school was invigorating. For the first time in decades, I was learning new things for my own benefit, rather than trying to solve other people's problems. The professors treated me as a peer rather than a maternal figure, and my fellow students sought my advice and collaboration on their projects. I also began traveling, something I had always wanted to do but had never been able to afford because of my children's constant financial needs. My first trip was to Ireland, a place I had dreamed of visiting since college. Walking through the countryside my grandmother had described in her stories, staying in bed and breakfast where I was treated as an interesting guest rather than a source of money, felt like discovering a part of myself that had been dormant for decades. The financial freedom that came from no longer supporting my children allowed me to be generous in ways that actually felt good. I increased my donations to the literacy program at the local library, funded a scholarship for single mothers pursuing education degrees, and even adopted a senior dog from the animal shelter, something I had wanted to do for years but had avoided because of the expense. My relationship with Emma, my granddaughter, deepened as I was able to focus on her genuine needs rather than being distracted by her father's manipulation. Sarah and I developed a friendship that was independent of Marcus, and Emma began spending weekends with me, learning to bake and garden and enjoying the undivided attention of a grandmother who was no longer emotionally exhausted by constant family drama. The most unexpected development was the gradual emergence of a social life that had nothing to do with my role as a mother. Graduate school introduced me to people who knew me as Maddie Roberts, psychology student and retired educator, rather than as Marcus, Tyler, and Chloe's mother. I made friends with whom I could have conversations about literature, current events, and ideas, rather than constantly managing crises and solving other people's problems. I even began dating, something that would have been unthinkable during the years when my children's needs consumed all of my emotional energy. Robert Chen, a retired history professor whose wife had died several years earlier, was a kind and intellectually curious man who had no interest in my finances and no expectations beyond enjoying my company. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, based on genuine compatibility and shared interests rather than need or dependency. Having dinner with someone who asked about my classes and my research, rather than requesting money or emotional support, felt like stepping into an alternate universe, where I was valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. As my second year of freedom from my children's manipulation progressed, I received occasional updates about their lives through family members and social media. Marcus and Sarah were struggling financially without my monthly supplements, and their marriage was showing signs of strain. Tyler had moved back in with roommates after his latest business venture failed, and he was working a series of temporary jobs that barely covered his expenses. Chloe had been forced to pick up extra shifts at the hospital to cover the bills that I had previously paid for her. None of them had attempted to rebuild a genuine relationship with me. Occasionally, one of them would send a text message asking about my health or mentioning some family news, but these communications always felt calculated, like attempts to test whether I might be softening my position rather than expressions of genuine care or interest. I responded politely but briefly to these overtures, making it clear that I was open to rebuilding our relationships, but only on terms that involved mutual respect and genuine accountability for their previous behavior. None of them were willing to take responsibility for what they had done, or to acknowledge that their treatment of me had been exploitative and hurtful. The final resolution came during my 65th birthday celebration, which I held at my house for a small group of friends from graduate school and my new social circle. It was a simple gathering, but it felt more genuinely celebratory than any family event I had experienced in years. As the evening was winding down, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Chloe standing on my porch, holding what appeared to be a birthday card. She was alone, which suggested that this was not another coordinated family intervention. I opened the door and invited her in, curious about what she might have to say after more than a year of minimal contact. "Happy birthday, Mom," she said, handing me the card. "I wanted to see how you were doing." We sat in my living room, which still held traces of the evening celebration. Wine glasses in the sink, leftover cake on the counter, books and papers from my graduate classes scattered on the coffee table. "You look good," Chloe said, and there was something different in her voice, less calculated and more genuinely observational. "You seem really happy." "I am happy," I replied simply. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," Chloe continued. "I think I understand now why you felt like you had to protect yourself from us. We weren't treating you very well." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of responsibility that any of my children had offered, and I waited to see if she would go further. "I miss having you in my life," she said. "I know I don't have any right to ask for another chance, but I was hoping maybe we could try to rebuild something. Not the same relationship we had before, but something honest and respectful." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but what I saw was something I hadn't seen from any of my children in years: genuine vulnerability and what appeared to be authentic remorse. "What would that look like, Chloe?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "I guess it would mean getting to know each other as adults rather than just as mother and daughter. It would mean me taking responsibility for my own life, instead of expecting you to solve my problems. And it would mean respecting your right to make your own decisions about your money and your future." The conversation continued for over an hour, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to my daughter rather than to someone who was trying to manipulate me. Chloe talked about her own growing understanding of how entitled and exploitive her behavior had been. She acknowledged that she had never really seen me as a complete person with my own needs and desires. "I think we learned to see you as just our mom, someone who existed to take care of us," she said. "We never really thought about who you were before we were born, or who you might want to be after we grew up." By the end of the evening, we had agreed to try rebuilding a relationship based on mutual respect and clear boundaries. I made it clear that I would not be resuming financial support, and that my estate planning would remain unchanged. If Chloe wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be because she valued my company and my presence in her life, not because she hoped to eventually benefit financially from our connection. Marcus and Tyler never made similar efforts to rebuild our relationships. They remained focused on the financial consequences of my decision, rather than examining their own behavior or taking responsibility for the damage they had caused. Over time, our contact dwindled to occasional text messages on holidays and birthdays, polite but distant communications between people who shared DNA but not much else. As I write this, 3 years have passed since I discovered that devastating text message conversation. I am 65 years old, in good health, financially secure, and happier than I have been since before my children were born. I have a master's degree in psychology that I earned for my own satisfaction rather than to solve other people's problems. I have friends who value my intelligence and my company. I have a relationship with a kind man who treats me as an equal partner rather than a source of support and resources. Most importantly, I have a relationship with myself that is no longer defined by my usefulness to other people. I am Maddie Roberts, not just someone's mother or someone's resource. I take up space in my own life. I make decisions based on my own needs and values. I have learned to distinguish between love and exploitation, between family loyalty and enabling destructive behavior. My house is quieter now, but it's not empty. It's filled with books I'm reading for pleasure, projects I'm pursuing out of curiosity, and relationships that nourish me rather than drain me. The woman who once measured her worth by how much she could sacrifice for ungrateful children has been replaced by someone who understands that real love requires boundaries, that genuine relationships require mutual respect, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst impulses. My children wanted me to be better off dead so they could inherit my money without having to wait for me to spend it on my own life. Instead, I made them better off broke, and in the process, I discovered that I was better off free. The inheritance they had been counting on is being used to fund my own dreams and adventures, to support causes I believe in, and to create the kind of life I always wanted but never thought I deserved. I don't know how many years I have left, but I know they will be years lived entirely for myself, surrounded by people who genuinely care about me rather than what they can extract from me. That turned out to be the most valuable inheritance of all. The gift of a life reclaimed and a self rediscovered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.